On July 22, 1991, two Milwaukee police officers entered apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments. At first, it looked normal. Cluttered furniture, dirty dishes, the faint smell of something rotten. Then one officer opened a drawer. Inside were dozens of Polaroid photographs. Each photo showed the same thing: human bodies, dismembered, arranged on the floor of the same apartment they were standing in. Realizing what they were looking at, the officer reportedly said 4 chilling words: "These are for real." Within minutes, they would find severed heads in the refrigerator, human skulls in the bedroom, and a barrel filled with dissolving human remains. But the most disturbing part of the story wasn't just what they found inside that apartment. It was how long Jeffrey Dahmer had been living there, killing people, while everyone around him had no idea. Let's tear into it. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. At first glance, his childhood looked ordinary. His father was a chemist. His mother struggled with mental health issues and heavy medication use. But inside the home, the environment was tense. Arguments between his parents were constant, and while the adults fought, young Jeffrey withdrew. Teachers later described him as quiet, distant, almost invisible. But there were already warning signs. As a child, Dahmer developed a strange fascination with dead animals. He collected roadkill from the side of the road. Sometimes he dissected them. Sometimes he dissolved the remains using chemicals from his father's lab supplies. To him, it was curiosity. But over time, that curiosity began to change. By high school, Dahmer had become deeply isolated. He rarely had friends. He struggled socially, and he had already developed a serious drinking problem. At just 17 years old, he was drinking constantly, sometimes even bringing alcohol to school. Meanwhile, his parents' marriage was collapsing. The arguments became louder, the tension worse. Eventually, his father moved out. Then something happened that would change everything. His mother left too. She took Dahmer's younger brother and moved away, leaving 18-year-old Jeffrey alone in the family home. No supervision, no structure, no one watching. 3 weeks later, someone would die there. On June 18, 1978, Dahmer was driving near Chippewa Lake in Ohio. He saw an 18-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Hicks was heading to a rock concert. Dahmer offered him a ride. Then he offered him something else: beer. They returned to Dahmer's house and spent several hours drinking and listening to music. Eventually, Hicks said he needed to leave, and that moment changed everything. Later, Dahmer said the thought of being alone again overwhelmed him, so he picked up a 10-pound dumbbell and struck Hicks from behind. When Hicks fell unconscious, Dahmer strangled him. It was the first time he had killed someone. But what happened next revealed something far darker. He dismembered the body in the basement, buried the remains, then dug them up weeks later to dissolve the flesh in acid, crushing the bones with a sledgehammer before scattering them in the woods. For nearly a decade after that, there were no more murders, but the fantasies never stopped. After the killing, Dahmer tried to build a normal life. He briefly attended Ohio State University, but he lasted only 3 months. His drinking had become uncontrollable. He dropped out with a GPA barely above 0. His father pushed him to enlist in the Army. For a while, the structure seemed to help. But the alcoholism followed him there too. By 1981, he was discharged, drifting again. Eventually, he moved to Milwaukee to live with his grandmother. From the outside, his life looked quiet. He worked, he kept to himself, but privately his thoughts were growing darker. He later admitted he had developed an obsession with control, not just relationships, total control. The kind of control where the other person could never leave. By the mid-1980s, Dahmer was spending time in Milwaukee's gay bars and bathhouses. But during encounters with partners, he became frustrated. They moved, they talked, they eventually left. And he couldn't accept that. So he came up with a solution: sleeping pills, crushed into drinks. His partners would lose consciousness, and Dahmer would do whatever he wanted. But even that stopped satisfying him. In 1987, he killed again. And once the murders started again, they didn't stop. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Dahmer lured young men to his apartment. Sometimes he offered money for photographs, sometimes just drinks. Once inside, they were drugged, then strangled. But murder was only the beginning. Dahmer photographed the bodies, dismembered them in his bathtub, preserved skulls and bones, and in several cases, consumed parts of his victims. Investigators would later discover he had begun planning something disturbing: a shrine, an altar made from human skulls, a place where he intended to sit and meditate among the remains of his victims. But by 1991, the situation inside his apartment was becoming impossible to hide. Neighbors at the Oxford apartments had been complaining for months. A horrible smell coming from apartment 213. Rotting. Sour. Sometimes they heard heavy objects dropping late at night. Once someone reported the sound of a power tool. The building manager confronted Dahmer multiple times. Every time he had an explanation. Spoiled meat, dead fish, a broken freezer, and somehow those explanations were accepted. But then came a moment that still shocks investigators today. In May 1991, a 14-year-old boy named Konorak Synthesomphone escaped from Dahmer's apartment. He ran into the street, naked, bleeding, barely able to speak. 3 women found him and called police. When officers arrived, Dahmer calmly approached them. He explained that the boy was his adult boyfriend, that they had been drinking, that the boy was simply intoxicated. Despite the protests of the witnesses, the officers believed him. They returned the child to Dahmer's apartment. Within hours, the boy was dead. It remains one of the most disturbing failures in modern policing. By the summer of 1991, Dahmer's behavior was spiraling out of control. He was killing more frequently. Bodies were piling up in his apartment, heads in the refrigerator, skeletons in the bedroom, a barrel filled with acid and human remains. The smell had become overwhelming. Dahmer later admitted he felt completely consumed by his urges. He described it as an incessant desire, a need that filled his mind constantly. Then, on July 22nd, everything finally unraveled. That night, Dahmer met a man named Tracy Edwards. He offered him money to pose for photographs. Inside the apartment, Dahmer tried to handcuff him, but Edwards realized something was wrong. He fought back and escaped. He ran into the street and flagged down police. When officers returned to the apartment, they noticed a knife near the bed. Then they opened the drawer. The photographs were inside. Dozens of Polaroids documenting dismembered bodies. Within minutes, the apartment was being searched. What they discovered was beyond anything they had imagined. 4 severed heads, 7 human skulls, human organs stored in the refrigerator, a freezer containing a torso, a 57-gallon drum dissolving bodies in acid, and 74 photographs documenting the crimes. Pinned to the floor in handcuffs, Dahmer quietly told the officers, "For what I did, I should be dead." Over the next several weeks, Dahmer confessed. More than 60 hours of interviews, a 178-page statement. He admitted to murdering 17 men and boys. He described the drugging, the killings, the dismemberment, the cannibalism, and the shrine he had planned to build. In 1992, he pleaded guilty but insane. The jury rejected the insanity defense. Dahmer was sentenced to multiple life sentences. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. But that wouldn't be long. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to a prison work detail. Another inmate named Christopher Scarver attacked him with a metal bar. Dahmer died shortly afterward. He was 34 years old. Jeffrey Dahmer became known as the Milwaukee Cannibal. But what continues to haunt people about the case isn't just the brutality of his crimes. It's how ordinary everything seemed on the outside. Neighbors smelled death. Victims escaped. Police even returned a child to his apartment. And still, the killings continued. For years, one of the most disturbing serial killers in American history lived quietly in a small apartment, hiding horrors behind a locked door. Thanks for watching.